A bit of a preface before we begin today's review. Originally, I had wanted to do a video review of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo for PC CD-ROM MS-DOS, not only because I hadn't seen a whole lot of videos cover that particular version, but also because it happens to be the very first Street Fighter game I ever owned a copy of, and can recall many fond memories of playing the game on my old 486 SX 50MHz with 8MB of RAM and far less hard drive capacity than what today's computers possess. Unfortunately, the game has issues running under the DOSBox emulator program, which I used to play many of my older DOS games, so such a review and return to memory lane is not possible. Still, wanting to do a Street Fighter 2 related review on DOS, I opted for the other PC version that I have, the one that most people are probably familiar with, and with that we begin the review proper. In any case, it goes without saying that Capcom's 1991 arcade classic Street Fighter 2 is one of the most recognized video games in the history of the medium, basically being responsible for the introduction of the one-on-one fighting game to a mass population. Now, while the genre had been in existence beforehand, with games like Karate Champ and the original Street Fighter being a couple examples, Street Fighter 2 redefined the formula to its finest form, resulting in a plethora of similar games being released in all shapes and sizes. Unsurprisingly, Capcom would later port their world-famous game to a variety of home video game consoles, including the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and there's even a PC version which I got through a compilation set. No doubt computer owners were excited since they would get their slice of the Street Fighter 2 pie that was being enjoyed by Nintendo and Sega owners, and no doubt that excitement instantly turned into bitter rage over the shoddy quality of this Street Fighter 2 PC conversion. For the most part, the graphics in this PC port of Street Fighter 2 looks fairly nice and somewhat comparable to the arcade original, but there are some quibbles. Ken and Ryu shoots Dalsim's fireballs for some strange particular reason. The stages are completely static, lifeless, and lacking in animation. Again, it's not bad, it's pretty good graphics actually, but it could have been a bit better even by the PC standards of those days. It feels kind of strange going to a stage like Guile's where there's people and they're not moving or cheering, they're sort of like frozen. But in any case, the graphics of Street Fighter 2 is pretty much the only high point here, as the rest of the game starts to fall apart afterwards. While you still have most of the sound bites from the arcade game and they all sound crisp and clear for the most part, the classic soundtrack of Street Fighter 2 has been raped, pillaged, and butchered beyond belief, with only a handful of tunes retained and barely sounding like those catchy tunes from the arcade original. They're not terrible renditions as long as your sound source isn't the default PC speaker option, because then it sounds really bad. But because of the lack of tracks, but they do get repetitive and you'll eventually be thankful for the God-given ability to turn the volume all the way down. Too bad you can't say the same for the gameplay though. You know, the part where you actually play the game, hence the term gameplay. Yeah, that part. The core gameplay is rather messed up. Fighters move at about a snail's pace and tend to have these really floaty high jumps as if they're fighting on the moon or something. The hit detection is questionable at best, downright insulting at worst. The AI is unstable, not knowing whether to be a human punching bag or just a plain cheap bastard, having a much easier time pulling off moves than you ever will. And for what it's worth, it is remotely possible to pull off all the familiar special moves on this control setup, which has you using one or two buttons depending on your gamepad or your keyboard setup. But the recognition and control is really hit and miss, and most of the time you'll end up using your regular attacks. Here's the best advice. You want to win this game hand over fist? Pick Dalsim and spam his extendo limbs for all they're worth. Master this cheapness like a fat kid mastering and eating a buffet, and you'll win every single time. It's an almost frustrating affair to get anything working properly. Just take Dalsim, you'll win every time. That simple. You could throw a yoga fireball if you want, doesn't matter, you just use the limbs. You'll win every single time. By the way, here's another piece of weirdness. Whenever Chun-Li does her lightning kick move, she actually lets out male grunts as opposed to the usual female grunts that she usually does, which is kind of strange. You know, I mean, in general, Street Fighter 2 on the PC MS-DOS version feels just wonky. Apparently functions like Street Fighter 2 about, I don't know, 10% of the time, maybe more, maybe less. But all the weird jumping physics and hit detection makes the whole thing feel like a third-grade computer project science thing. And not like the arcade game people fell in love with. It can even be argued that this game makes the original Street Fighter arcade game from 1987 play like a masterpiece, and anyone who has played that game will tell you otherwise. And yet, that game plays a hell of a lot better than this piece of crap. Now look, let me make something perfectly clear. I'm not the foremost authority on the intricacies of Street Fighter 2. I'm no super competitive player who's studied this game all his life and know all the little inner details about which frames hit what, or what the differences are between Minute Arcade Revision 2.99 and Minute Arcade Revision 2.99-ATS. Not trying to be that. Not trying to come off as that. But I think I've played enough Street Fighter 2 over the years to know how it generally works. How it's generally supposed to work, at least. And this game doesn't play like any Street Fighter 2 that I'm familiar with. And if I notice something is off in a major way, then something must seriously be wrong with this version. Street Fighter 2 on the PC MS-DOS format, as well as quite frankly any other computer console format of the time, is nowhere near the strong offering that the Super Nintendo received around the same time. Even with the limited capabilities and potential that the PCs possessed in that early period, there were games on the platform that really excelled, and were also decidedly fun to play as well. Street Fighter 2 is not one of those games, and is a horrible insult to the Street Fighter legacy. It seems rather sad that while US Go regurgitated this half-assed port of the hit arcade game, PC gamers were amazed by games like Castle Wolfenstein 3D, or X-Wing, or Wing Commander. Yeah, 1992, 1993, yeah, they could have done so much better than this garbage. So much better than this garbage. These days, this version of Street Fighter 2 is rather impossible to play on modern PCs without some DOS emulator program, like DOSBox for example. And perhaps that's for the best, because the last thing we need is the resurgence of this garbage. If you want to play some Street Fighter 2, you have a wide variety of options. Get the Super Nintendo version, get the Sega Genesis version, get the PlayStation version, Xbox Live Arcade, the Game Boy version, MAME if you want to go in that direction. Hell, I say go out and find one of those pirated Street Fighter 2 games that litter the NES. Don't subject yourself to this god-awful garbage. Just don't play it. Don't bother with this one. It ain't worth it.